How do you do, Storyteller here, back with another episode of me reading Pilgrim's Regress by C.S. Lewis. We left off on chapter 4, and the title of this chapter is Leah for Rachel. Greed to recover desire hides the real offer of its return. He tries to force himself to feel it, but finds and accepts lust instead. I don't know what that means. Again, the title's at the beginning, right after the chapter. At the top. I don't know what that means, but I might put all of them together at the end, and they might make sense. Anyway. Leah for Rachel. Then I turned over in my sleep and began to dream deeper still, and I dreamed that I saw John growing tall and lank till he ceased to be a child and became a boy. The chief pleasure of his life in these days was to go down the road and to look through the window in the tall wall in hope of seeing the beautiful island. Some days he saw it well enough, especially at first, and heard the music and the voice. At first he would not look through the window into the woods unless he heard the music, but after a time both sight of the island and the sounds became very rare. He would stand looking through the window for hours and seeing the wood, but not the sea or the island beyond it. Shut up! But not the sea or the island beyond it. And straining his ears, but hearing nothing except the wind and the leaves, and the yearning... Excuse you. Hey! This is why we don't do live recordings. And the yearning for that side of the island, and the sweet wind blowing over the water from it, though indeed these themselves had given him only yearning, became so terrible that John thought he would die if he did not have them again soon. He even said to himself, I would break every rule in the card for them, if only I could get them. I would go down the black hole for ever it had a window from which I could see the island. Then it came into his head that perhaps he ought to explore the wood, and thus might find his way down to the sea beyond it. So he determined that the next day, whatever he saw or heard at the window, he would go through and spend the whole day in the wood. When the morning came, it had been raining all night, and the south wind had blown the clouds away at sunrise, and all was fresh and shining. As soon as he had his breakfast, John was out on the road. With the winds and the birds and the country carts passing, there were many noises about that morning, so that when John heard a strain of music along before he had reached the wall and window, a strain like that which he had desired, but coming from an unexpected quarter, he could not be absolutely certain that he had not imagined it. It made him stand still in the road for a moment, and in my dream I could hear him thinking, like this, if I go after that sound, away off the road, up yonder, it is luck whether I shall find anything at all. But if I go on into the window, I know I shall reach the wood, and there I can have a good hunt for the shore and the island. In fact, I shall insist on finding it. I'm determined to. But if I go a new way, I shall not be able to insist. I shall have to take what comes. So he went on to the place he knew and climbed through the window into the wood. Up and down and to and fro among the trees he walked, looking this way and that. But he found no sea and no shore, and indeed no end to the wood in any direction. When it came to the middle of the day, he was so hot that he sat down and fanned himself. Often of late, when the sight of the island had been withheld, he had felt sad and despairing, but what he felt now was more like anger. I must have it, he kept saying to himself, and then, I must have something. And then it occurred to him that at least he had the wood, which he would have loved, and that he had not given it a thought all morning. Very well, thought John, I shall enjoy the wood. I will enjoy it. He set his teeth and wrinkled his forehead and sat until the sweat rolled off of him in an effort to enjoy the wood. But the more he tried, the more he felt that there was nothing to enjoy. There was the grass and there were the trees, but what am I going to do with them? Said John. Next it came to his head that he might perhaps get the old feeling, for what, he thought, had the island ever given him anything but a feeling? By imagining? He shut his eyes and set his teeth again and made a picture of the island in his mind, but he could not keep his attention on the picture because he wanted all the time to watch some other part of his mind to see if there was a feeling that was beginning. But no feeling began, and then, just as he was opening his eyes, he heard a voice speaking to him. It was quite close at hand, and very sweet, not at all the old voice of the woods. He looked around and saw what he had never expected, yet he was not surprised. There in the grass beside him sat a laughing brown girl of about his age. She had no clothes on. "It was me you wanted," said the brown girl. "I am better than your silly islands." And John rose and caught her all in a haste and committed fornication with her in the wood. Sorry, I wasn't prepared for that. Chapter 5. The deception does not last, but it leaves a habit of sin behind it. After that, John was always going to the wood. He did not always have his pleasure of her in the body, but it often ended that way. Sometimes he would talk to her about himself, telling her lies about his courage and his cleverness. All that he told her she remembered, so that on other days she could tell it over to him again. Sometimes even he would go with her to the wood looking for the sea and the island, but not often. Meanwhile the year went on, and the leaves began to fall in the wood, and the skies were more often grey, until now, as I dreamed, John had slept in the wood and awoke up in the wood. The sun was low, and a blustering wind kept stripping the leaves from the branches. The girl was still there, and the appearance of her was hateful to John, and he saw that she knew this, and the more she knew it, the more she stared at him, smiling. He looked around and saw how small the wood was after all, a nearly beggarly strip of trees between the road and the field that he knew well. Nowhere in sight was anything that he liked at all. "I shall not come back here," said John. "What I wanted is not here. It wasn't you I wanted, you know." "Wasn't it?" said the brown girl. "Then be off. You must take your family with you." With that she put up her hands and her mouth called. Instantly from behind every tree slipped out a brown girl, each of them just like herself. The little wood was full of them. "What are these?" "Our daughters," she said. "Didn't you know that you were a father? Did you think I was barren, you fool? And now children," she added, turning to the mob. "Go with your father." Suddenly John became very much afraid and leaped over the wall into the road. He ran home as fast as he could. What am I reading? Chapter 6. I don't know what's going on. Quem quiteris in There's a whole lot of Latin. If any of you know what that means, it's a whole lot of Latin. Sin and law torment him, each aggravating the other. From that day forth, until he left his home, John was not happy. First, all of the weight of the rules he had broken descended upon him. For while he was going daily to the wood, he almost forgotten the landlord, and now suddenly the whole reckoning was to pay. In the second place, his last sight of the island was now so long ago, he had forgotten to wish for it even, and almost how to set about looking for it. At first he feared to go back to the window in the wall, lest he should meet with the brown girl. But he soon found her family were so constantly with him that the place made no difference. Whenever he sat down to rest in a place, there, sooner or later, there would be a little brown girl beside him. When he sat in the evening with his father and mother, a brown girl visible only to him would sit idle at his feet, and sometimes his mother would fix her eyes on him, and even ask him what he was staring at. But most of all they plagued him whenever he had a fit of fright about the landlord or the black hole. It was always the same. He would wake one morning full of fear, take down his card and read it in front of it, and determine that today he would really begin to keep the rules. And for that day he would, but the strain was intolerable. He used to comfort himself by saying, "It will be easier as I go on. Tomorrow it will be easier," but tomorrow was always harder, and the third day was worst of all. And the third day, when he crept away to bed, to the death and raw in his soul, always he would be sure to find a brown girl waiting for him there, and on such a night he had no spirit to resist her blandishments. But when he perceived that no place was more or less haunted than another, he came sidling back to the window in the wall. He had little hopes of it. He visited it as a man visits a grave. It was full of winter now, and the grove was naked and dark. The trees dripped in it. and the stream he saw now was little more than a gutter, full of dead leaves and mud. The wall, too, was broken where she had jumped over it. Yet John stood there a long time, many winter evenings, looking into it, and he seemed himself to have reached the bottom of misery. One night as he was trudging home from it, he began to weep. The thought of the first day when he had heard the music seen on the island, and the longing, not now for the island itself, but for that moment when he had sweetly longed for it, began to well up a warm wave, sweeter and sweeter, till he thought he could bear no more, and yet the sweeter again, till on top of it, unmistakably, there came the short sound of music, as if a string had been plucked or a bell struck once. At the moment a coach had gone by him. He turned and looked after it, in time to see a head even being withdrawn from the window, and he thought he heard a voice say, "Come." And far beyond the coach, among the hills of the western horizon, he thought he saw a shining sea in the faint shape of an island. Not much more than a cloud. It was nothing compared to what he had seen the first time. It was so much further away, but his mind was made up. That night he waited till his parents were asleep, and then putting a few needments together, he stole out the back door and set his face to the west to seek the island. Well, apparently there are several books within this book. We finished book 1 and we're on to book 2. We're only 11 minutes in, so let's keep reading. We're on to book 2, entitled Thrill. Thou shalt not make to thyself a graven image, nor the likeness of anything that is in the heaven above. That's Exodus. This is a quote by Plato. The soul of man, therefore, desiring to learn what manner of things these are, casteth her eyes upon objects akin to herself, whereof none sufficeth. And then it is that she saith, With the Lord and with the things thereof I spoke. There is nothing in that likeness. When then is it alike? This is the question, O son of Dahya. That is the cause of all evils, or rather the travail within the soul travelleth about it. Dante. Following false copies of the good, that no sincere fulfilment of the promises make. Spenser. In the hand she boldly took, to make another like the former dame, another florimel in the shape and look, so lively and so like, that many it mistook. I don't know what any of that means. None whatsoever. I have no idea what that means. Chapter 1. Dixit incipiens. It's more Latin. He began to think for himself and meets 19th century rationalism. Still I lay dreaming in bed, and I looked and I saw John go plodding along the road westward in the bitter black of a frosty night. He walked along so long that the morning broke. Then presently John saw a little inn by the side of the road, and a woman with a broom who had opened the door and was sweeping out the rubbish. So he turned in there and called for a breakfast, and while it was cooking he sat down in a hard chair by the newly lit fire and fell asleep. When he woke, the sun was shining in through the window, and there was breakfast laid by his side. Another traveller was already eating. He was a big man with red hair and red stubble on all 3 of his chins, buttoned up very tight. When they had both finished, the traveller rose and cleared his throat, and stood with his back to the fire, and he cleared his throat again and said, "A fine morning, young sir." "Yes, sir," said John. "Are you going west, perhaps, young man?" I think so." "Is it possible that you don't know me?" "I'm a stranger here." "No offense," said the stranger, "but my name is Mr. Enlightenment, and I believe it is pretty generally known. I shall be happy to give you my assistance and protection as far out as our ways lie together." John thanked him very much for this, and when they went out from the inn there was a neat little trap waiting, with a fat little pony between the shafts. I think that's like a carriage. And its eyes were so bright and its harness was so well polished that it was difficult to say which was twinkling the keener in the morning sunshine. They both got up into the trap carriage, and Mr. Enlightenment whipped up the fat little pony, and they went bowling along the road as if nobody had a care in the world. presently they began to talk. "And where might you be from, my fine lad?" said Mr. Enlightenment. "From Puritania, sir," said John. "A good place to leave, eh?" "I'm so glad you think that," cried John. "I was afraid—" "I hope I am a man of the world," said Mr. Enlightenment. "Any young fellow who is anxious to better himself may depend on finding sympathy and support in me. Puritania! Why, I suppose you've been brought up afraid of the landlord." "Well, I must admit I sometimes do feel rather nervous." "You may make your mind easy, my boy. There is no such person." "There is no landlord?" "There is absolutely no such thing. I might even say no such entity in existence. There has never been and never will be." "And this is absolutely certain?" cried John, for great hope was rising in his heart. "Absolutely certain. Look at me, young man. I ask you, do I look as if I was easily taken in?" "Oh, no," said John hastily. "I was just wondering, though. I mean, how did they all come to think there was such a person?" "The landlord is an invention of one of those stewards, all made up to keep the rest under their thumb. And, of course, the stewards are hand in the glove with the police. They are a shrewd lot, those stewards. They know which side their bread is buttered on, all right. Clever fellows. I can't help admiring them." "But you mean the stewards don't believe it themselves?" "I dare say they do. It's just the sort of cock-and-bull story they would believe. They're simple old souls, most of them, just like children. They have no knowledge of modern science and would believe anything they were told." I know I lean forward when I read. John was silent for a few moments. Then he began, "But how do you know there's no landlord?" "Christopher Columbus." Good. "Galileo. The earth is round. Invention of printing. Gunpowder!" exclaimed Mr. Enlightenment, with such a loud voice that the pony shied. Shied? "I beg your pardon?" "Eh?" said Mr. Enlightenment. "I don't quite understand," said John. "Why, it's plain as pikestaff," said the other. "Your people in Puritania believe the landlord because they have not had the benefits of scientific training. For example, I dare say it would be news to you to hear that the earth was round as an orange, my lad." "Well, I don't know that it would," said John, feeling a little disappointed. My father always said it was round." "No, my dear boy," said Mr. Enlightenment. "You must have misunderstood him. It is well known that everyone in Puritania thinks the earth is flat. It is not likely that I should be mistaken on a point. Indeed, it is out of the question. Then again, there is a paleontological evidence." "What's that?" "Why, they tell you in Puritania that the landlord makes all of these roads. But that is quite impossible, for the old can remember the time when the roads were not nearly so good as they are now. And what is more, scientists have found all over the country traces of old roads running in quite different directions. The inference is obvious." John said nothing. "I said," repeated Mr. Enlightenment, "that the inference was obvious." "Oh, yes, of course," John said hastily, turning a little red. "Then again, there is anthropology." "I'm afraid I don't know—" "Bless me, of course you don't. They don't mean you to know. An anthropologist is a man who goes around your backwoods villages in these parts, collecting the odd stories of the country people to tell about the landlord. Why, there is one village where they think that he has a trunk like an elephant. Now anyone can see that wouldn't be true." "Be quiet! Hey!" "I'm gonna come over there." "It's very unlikely." "And what's better still, we know how the villagers came to think so. It all began by an elephant escaping the local zoo. And when some old villager, he was probably drunk, saw it wandering up the mountain one night, so the story grew up that the landlord had a trunk." "Did they catch the elephant again?" "Did who?" "The anthropologists." "Oh, my dear boy, you are misunderstanding. This happened long before there were any anthropologists." "Then how do they know?" "Well, as to that, I see you have a very crude notion of how science actually works. To put simply, of course, you could not understand the technical explanation. To put it simply, they know that the escaped elephant must have been the source of the trunk story because they know that that an escaped snake must have been the source of the snake hypothesis, my dear young friend. This establishes itself by a circulative process. Or to use popular language, if you make the same guess often enough, it ceases to be a guess and becomes scientific fact. After he thought for a while, John said, I think I see. Most of the stories about the landlord are probably untrue, therefore the rest are probably untrue. Well, that is as near to a beginner can get to it, perhaps. But when you've had scientific training, you'll understand that you can be quite certain about all sorts of things, which now seem to you only probable. Oh, I don't like this guy. By the time the fat little pony had them several miles, and they had come to a place where a by-road went off to the right. If you're going to the west, we must part here, said Mr. Enlightenment, drawing up, unless perhaps you would care to come home with me. You see that magnificent city? John looked down by the by-road and saw on a flat plain without any trees a huge collection of congregated iron huts, most of which seemed rather old and rusty. That, said Mr. Enlightenment, is the city of Claptrap. You will hardly believe me when I say I can remember it as a miserable village. When I came here it had only 40 inhabitants. Now it boasts a population of 12,400,361 souls, who include, I might add, the majority of our most influential publicists and scientific popularizers. It is an unprecedented development I am proud to say I've borne no small part of. But it is no mock modesty to add the invention of the printing press has been important to the merely personal agency. If you would care to join us. Well, thank you, said John, but I think I will keep to the main road a little longer. He got out of the trap and turned to bid goodbye to Mr. Enlightenment. Then a sudden thought came to his head, and he said, I'm not sure I really understood all of your arguments, sir. Is it absolutely certain there is no landlord? Absolutely. I give you my word of honor. And with these words they shook hands. Mr. Enlightenment turned the pony's head up by the by-road, gave it a touch by the whip, and in a few moments it was out of sight. End of chapter 1 of the second book. We shall continue on in the next video, so thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying it so far, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye!